a year, and there are stories in there. His goal in life is to get people to Bill take over and tell his story. So many of you know Bill Williams. Those who do not, Bill is active here at Rydell Park in scheduling programs, and he's going to tell you his story tonight, World War II.
Thank you, Don.
Put this on the belt.
I guess it's better.
It doesn't slip on too well, but pocket or whatever.
That's on. All right. You want to put it on me? Good. We're in business, right? Yep. Before presenting my main speech, I would like to mention two items. The first item, I put together 13 pages entitled My Memories of World War II, which I gave to each of our 4 children, plus making it available to our grandchildren. And here it is. They asked me, what did you do in World War II? So there's the story. Second item. As you know, World War II began September 1, 1939 with the Phony War. And in July and August 1939, I was in Europe, attending the World Conference of Christian Youth in Amsterdam, Holland, as a representative of the Presbyterian Church. Western Europe knew war was coming, but France was overconfident because of the Maginot Line, and England was desperately behind in their preparations for conflict. They knew it was coming. I came home on the last trip of the Normandy, 2 weeks before war began. You remember the Normandy burned at a pier in New York. In September 1940, as a member of the Essex Troop, Horse Cavalry, I was inducted into federal service, and we were sent to Fort Jackson, Columbia, South Carolina. Incidentally, on the posters which I put together, cavalry is spelled C-A-L-V-A-R-Y, so obviously someone with a religious bent did it. I think you know how the word cavalry is really spelled, but I loved it, so I left it. We became the 102nd Horse Mechanized Cavalry. While many units had wooden guns, we were fortunate. We had World War I Springfield rifles. During the Carolina maneuvers, chiggers ate us alive. Now, have any of you ever been bitten by a chigger? They can bite. But we found the answer, and the answer was, if we painted our legs with nail polish remover, the chiggers couldn't get at our legs. The only thing is, none of the women in Carolina could find any more nail polish remover, because we bought it all up. Incidentally, when I was in the cavalry, I did at one time serve on the remount detail, and that is the breaking of horses. I have been bitten, I have been kicked, and I'm sorry to tell you this, but one day a horse threw me in the watering trough. I think that was awful. Knowing that tanks were going to replace our horses, and having the required years of college, I applied for transfer to pilot training in the Army Air Corps. Incidentally, do you remember the cry from all service camps, Ohio, over the hill in October? Because when we were inducted in September, our length of federal service by law was only going to be 12 months. Do you realize that the vote in the Congress extending it was 203 in favor, 202 opposed. One vote decided to extend federal service to 18 months. And then, of course, came Pearl Harbor, and of course, then everything was off. So, I started my training at Maxwell Field, Montgomery, Alabama, and then I was sent to the Southeastern Flying Training Command, and I was an aviation cadet in Douglas, Georgia, and we were flying Stearman biplanes, the PT-17, which incidentally, even today, stunt pilots use. It's a beautiful plane to do stunts in. You had to fly, you had to solo, take a plane up and fly it alone in 12 hours or less, or you were washed out. They didn't have time to wait. And so, luckily I made it. Incidentally, I was fortunate in that I had a wonderful civilian instructor, Dudley Reed. Dudley had built 3 planes with his own hands. He had stunted them. And if you know the great stunt pilots, Dudley had flown with people like Mike Murphy, Tex Rankin, Major Udette. And Major Udette later became second in command of the Luftwaffe. But he was a great stunt pilot before the war. And then I went from Douglas, Georgia to basic at Shaw Field, Sumter, South Carolina, a very lovely, sleepy town, which we used to call the finest lighted graveyard in the entire United States. From there I went to Albany, Georgia, Turner Field for multi-engine advanced. And after finishing there, I should have had to leave. But unfortunately, they were desperate for crews overseas. So I had to go AWOL to get married. And my wife is sitting in the back. And in August of this year, Betty, I hope I get it right, we will have been together for 57 years. And incidentally, our 4th child, our son Chip, is sitting back there keeping guard. Well, 3 of us went AWOL of my class, which was 42G, to get married. When we showed up at MacDill Field, Tampa, Florida, the commanding general wanted to see us for a little private interview. We were fortunate because his adjutant, the major, took us aside and said, "Gentlemen, I'm going to give you another wedding present. When you go in to see the general, I want the most rigid brace you've ever been in. I want the snappiest salute you've ever thrown. And for 5 minutes, he's going to chew your ass out. But after that, he's going to smile and tell you, don't you ever do it again." And that's exactly what happened. At MacDill Field, I was in training in the B-26. Now, the Army Air Corps had 2 medium bombers, the Billy Mitchell, which went on the Tokyo raid off the Hornet, and the B-26. The B-25 was made by North American, the B-26 by Martin. Incidentally, I have flown the B-25, but the B-26 had the highest wing loading of any aircraft in the world. It was known as the Widowmaker. It was also known as the Flying Prostitute. No visible means of support. And like the Bumblebee, it wasn't supposed to fly. A bumblebee isn't supposed to fly. We also coined a wonderful phrase in training, a ship a day in Tampa Bay. And what was happening on takeoff, we had Curtiss Electric propellers, and they were running past the stops, and they went wild. And of course, these ships then would spin in, and we'd lost another B-26. We killed more people in training than any other aircraft the Air Corps had. We had the lowest combat losses of any plane that the Air Corps had. It was a magnificent fighting ship if you could survive. And so I was delighted to take it overseas. I picked up my plane at Hunter Field, Savannah, Georgia. Hunter Field is still there. It's still a big airport. And on the way over, I went to Puerto Rico. I went into Trinidad. I went into, I have to start and think here, that's why we wrote this up. We went to Georgetown, Dutch Guiana. You know, that's where the 700 people committed suicide a few years ago. Belém, Brazil, Natal, Brazil, Ascension Island, Liberia, Dakar, Rabat, and then to Djita, which was the base just to the west of the city of Tunis. When I flew into Ascension Island, which is just a piece of volcanic rock in the South Atlantic, the crew that greeted us on the ground said, they didn't ask did we have any whiskey aboard. They said, do you have any shaving lotion? We'll do the distilling. When I took off from Ascension Island, I couldn't get my nose wheel to retract. The main gear went up. The nose wheel didn't retract, so I've got a nose wheel hanging in the breeze. The commanding officer said, I want you to fly onto Robertsfield, Liberia. I don't want you to try a landing, an emergency landing here at Ascension Island. On the way to it, and we're flying over the South Atlantic, at one point, to show you the foolish things we did, we've read the tech manuals, we've tried every procedure in the book, and at one point I have my mechanic with a rope around him, hanging down in the nose wheel, 12,000 feet over the South Atlantic. He said, make sure the rope is tight. But he couldn't do anything. At Robertsfield, the commanding officer said, I order you to bail out your crew. They didn't want to jump, so I sent my co-pilot back, and I said, kick them, because the commanding officer says they have to jump. So they did. And then the co-pilot turned to me and he said, Bill, what are you planning to do? I said, I think this jumping is dangerous. I intend to fly this in. Now, it's up to you. If you want to jump, go ahead. But I'm not going to do it. By then, of course, and this is where the Firestone rubber plantation is. By then, of course, the fire trucks, the ambulances, we've got a wonderful reception committee waiting for a crash landing. Because we're going to bring it in with the wheels up. We did, but I made a long, low approach, and at one point I told my co-pilot, cut all the switches, say prayer, because there's no go-around. This is it. We made it. Unfortunately, my ship, which was named the Lady Betty, we sprung the main spar on the landing. So we had to wait 30 days to get a new bomber to go to combat. During this time, we spent most of our time on the Firestone plantation. We were invited every night for dinner. They started serving drinks at 5 and food at midnight. You have never met anyone until you've met. These are men that have been on the tea plantations in the Dutch East Indies and plantations all over the world. They're graduates of Cornell, Michigan State, University of Georgia. That's where they get their training. But drink? Oh no. One day I was asked if I'd like to go on a leopard hunt. Thank goodness I was told, are you a crack shot if your life depends on it? I said, why don't I stay on your veranda and drink? Why don't you go shoot the leopards? Incidentally, I missed an opportunity. 3 skins, which I could have bought for $24, Betty could have had a leopard skin coat. So look what I did. I let her down. Incidentally, I watched them tapping the rubber trees. When the latex, which is just like a milky substance, you can take it, roll it in your hand, you got a ball. You got a bouncing ball right then. So it was an interesting experience. Then we went on, and of course, finally got a replacement ship. And the B-26, I've got a picture there on the piano for you to see. I have to stop and think a minute, I had 14 50 caliber machine guns on that ship. One of the interesting things, We never had to worry about frontal attacks. The B-17s used to have trouble with frontal attacks. We were never attacked front on. The reason being that on my control column I had a button. I had a ring of 5 50 caliber machine guns. I just pressed the button. My bombardier up in the nose, the plexiglass nose, he had a 50 caliber too. So we had 6 guns pointing forward. We had a top turret with 2, we had a tail turret with 2, and out the sides at 5 and 7 o'clock we had 1 each. So we had 14 50 calibers on that plane. We were based at Jeddah, which is just to the west of the city of Tunis. Carthage is just to the east, you know. There isn't much left of Carthage, the reason being the GIs were sending it home to Mother in World War II. Picking up bundles, and they wanted Mother to have a little bit of Carthage. So Hannibal would be upset if he returned. We, of course, flew missions out of there, and then later we moved up to Sardinia. Incidentally, the history of the 319th Bomb Group is right there on the table. We do put out a wonderful newsletter of the 319th. A couple of them are there. Incidentally, I should have told you, do you remember 1939, the World's Fair? I saved that from 1939. We then moved up to Sardinia. When we moved into Sardinia, the Germans had stripped the island. They'd taken all the food, they'd taken all the medicines, and to me, this is the wonder of Americans. The first night that we ate on the island, I saw a lot of the Italian men, women, and children, and they came and were, of course, after you went through the chow line, you'd throw the remainder into these big barrels. And they brought tin cans, and they wanted to dip in the barrel. The first GI that saw that, get at the end of the line, just like we are, and go through. We started feeding them. When we found out they didn't have any medicine, no bandages or anything, all the flight surgeons, they didn't have much trouble with us. There weren't many that were sick or anything. So we had the Italians showing up at 10 o'clock and being treated by our flight surgeons. I think it's the only decent thing to do. We had a wonderful field in Sardinia. Incidentally, this is, one of the favorites of the jet set of the world. I didn't think it was a favorite of anyone when I was there, but our commanding officer thought up a brilliant idea. We had a huge runway, both in length and width. And he said, if we line up 6 bombers abreast and take off together, this is the way pursuit planes do it. He thought up this brilliant idea. And then when we come into land, 6 bombers abreast coming into land, we can add 150 to 200 more miles to our bomb range. And we can go deeper towards targets. Frankly, that scared me more than the fighters. Because when you take off, if you were ever to slip behind one of those planes on takeoff, you're now not at high speed, you'll roll right over on your back and go in. And in going into land, 6 abreast, again, if you were to shift behind one of those other planes, you'll roll right over and spin in. That scared me more than the fighters. But he had a brilliant idea. He later became the commanding general of all our forces, air forces in Europe. So he must have had something. Our commanding general was Jimmy Doolittle, a wonderful man. Jimmy, aeronautical engineer, PhD from MIT, flown everything that has wings. I think he's flown a lot that didn't have wings. And one story I'll tell you, I saw Jimmy about 15, 20 years ago in Chicago. You still called him General. He was now head of the RAND Corporation, the think tank out in California. I said to him, have you ever seen that movie that they put on TV when they can't think of anything else? 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. And I'll always remember it. Jimmy just died about a year ago. He said, Bill, I have never seen the movie, but I was there. He led the Tokyo raid off the Hornet. He was there, that's right. Oh, one thing I forgot to tell you that I should have mentioned when I was on the Firestone Rubber Plantation. I was playing golf one day, and I'm ready to putt on one of the greens, and my host said, "Bill, freeze." And all of a sudden I saw a snake go flying through the air. Now all the snakes in Liberia are poisonous. Right behind me was a gaboon viper, and he had seen it, and he just took an iron out, and just did a little swish, and here goes a snake flying by my ears. The other thing I should have mentioned, because I should have brought this caddy home. For 18 holes, I had a caddy with a big tray on his head, a bucket with beer iced down, and for 18 holes, he never took that tray off his head, and anytime he wanted a beer, he just reached up there, handed you one. I saw a lady in Liberia carrying a Singer sewing machine on her head. I mean, they use their head in that country. All right. I forgot that, and I wanted to tell it to you. All right. We had a lot of wonderful entertainment. We had Bob Hope, we had Martha Ray, we had Frances Langford, we had Yehudi Mendoin and his sister. Yehudi just died recently. Frederick March, Adolphe Manjou, Kay Francis, Henry Morgenthau, Arthur Rubinstein. I was in Algiers one day in the Red Cross Club. There's a gentleman seated at the piano. He's just wearing khakis, and he's doing finger exercises. I'll never forget it. A wonderful GI from Brooklyn walks up to him and says, "Hey, bud, instead of that foolishness, how about playing something?" The gentleman turned around, and he was going to be entertaining the troops, and he said, "Son, I'll be delighted to play for you." And for an hour and a half, Arthur Rubinstein, the world's greatest pianist, played for the boy from Brooklyn and everyone else. So, "Hey, bud, stop that playing. Let's hear something." So he did it. All right, on my 13th mission, my left engine, I completed the bomb run, dropped my bombs, but suddenly I looked up and I saw that the oil pressure on my left engine was heading for zero. There is a piece of flak. That's what cut the oil line. Now all flak is pieces of metal which an anti-aircraft gun throws into the air with beautiful accuracy. The Germans in the 88 millimeter had the finest anti-aircraft gun in the world. We used to think we ought to take a basket of medals over and drop them to them because they ought to be rewarded. But that's what got my engine. So I flew a B-26 for 2.5 hours on one engine and got it back to the base. It was an interesting experience. Some of the other things that, it's fun to think of some things that the memories we have. For example, the food. Don't ever serve me Spam. I don't want to say it again. I know the name. Powdered eggs, ersatz potatoes, cream dried beef, which was known affectionately as SOS. And I won't tell you because you're nice ladies what SOS stands for. But all these GIs know. We long for real eggs. Now, one thing we could do, we could get them. We found out if we took our mattress covers, sold them to the Arabs, we could get $20 worth of eggs. Now the problem was, how do you get more mattress covers? Well, we had in every squadron, we had a stripped-down bomber, which used to take a mixture of ground and air personnel who hadn't been on leave, and we'd fly down to Egypt. They were not in the war. And in Egypt, you could get Heinz 57 varieties, Campbell's soup, you could get ladies' lingerie, you could get silk stockings, they had everything. So we'd load up with whiskey, go back to the base, you go to the quartermaster corps, you get the sergeant aside and you say, "Now, would you like a little Johnny Walker red or black? What's your favorite?" And you'd haul out a case. And he'd say, "Now, just how many mattress covers do you need?" And this is the way we kept getting eggs. I flew one of the egg flights from Algiers one day back to Sardinia. I must have had close to 10,000 eggs on board. the most beautiful takeoff and landing you've ever seen, or I would have had a hell of an omelet, I'll tell you. But we made it. All right, let's see. Tent life. We originally bathed out of our helmets, but then we built showers. At first, we didn't have any way to heat our tents, but we decided, you know, more than the airplanes needed 100-octane gasoline, so we built heaters, and we were using 100-octane gasoline. I happened to be the one that set up the stock club. Now, you know, the first thing you do when you move to a new base, you build a club for the enlisted men and a club for the officers. I mean, even before tents go up, you got to have that. Well, we named our officers' club the Stock Club. We contacted Sherman Billingsley, who owned the Stock Club in New York City. He sent us everything we needed. We had glasses, stirrers, napkins, everything you needed that the New York Stock Club had, we had. And of course, we had no trouble getting the spirits for the club. Incidentally, Bob Hope opened the club the first night. And he told the greatest collection of off-color jokes I've ever heard in my life. And I said, if you could only do this on radio, you'd be a success. He said, I better not try it. But they were wonderful off-color. I mean, the tears were running down. For an hour and a half, I'm crying. We also, of course, in our life, had to build slit trenches. And you built those right outside your tent. And naturally, this is where you were supposed to go in the middle of the night rather than the latrines, because you didn't want to go to latrines. The only thing is, you made a mistake of throwing a lot of things in the slit trench you shouldn't have done. And so if you dove in there in the middle of the night, you might be surprised when the bombers came over. But that was life. Incidentally, the movies, one night we're watching a movie, and the hero is in trouble. Well, thank goodness one of the men in our audience drew his .45 and shot out the screen. You got to help the hero when he's in trouble. Going into Tunis, we rode in our Jeep, and we went right through a Roman aqueduct, which is still there today, and was running water for the city of Tunis in Tunisia. So the Romans were good builders. I was on the Monte Cassino Abbey raid, and when we bombed Monte Cassino, we destroyed it. American money rebuilt it. But the thing I always remember is that 5 minutes after coming off that target, we turned on our radios for Berlin Sally, and Berlin Sally's playing a little Glenn Miller in the background and saying, a great deed of infamy has just been done. They have bombed Monte Cassino Abbey. We're nothing but Christians who are anti-aircraft men with German uniforms. No, she didn't say that. That's what we knew were there. Well, anyway, it was rebuilt. In December of '43, our original group of 24 flight crews were now down to 12 flight crews and no replacements coming in. Each squadron had 24 crews. Incidentally, the flight surgeon was a tent mate of mine, and every now and then I used to try and show him how to fill out a Section 8 so he could send me home and determine I was a mental wreck and the war was over. He never got the idea through his head. He went on a mission one day. He made that mistake. And the mission he went on, he's in the lead plane. The wing plane on his right goes down in flames. The wing plane on his left goes down in flames. He comes back, and I said, how'd you like it? He said, my God, it's dangerous out there. He said, I'm never going again. Well, I've got to go. Why don't you sign the Section 8 for me and send me home? I'm nuts. He wouldn't do it. Well, we got new gunners, and I'll never forget being introduced to him. I said, where'd you get your gunnery training? We needed them. He said, we're rejects from Cooks and Bakers School. I said, have you ever been acquainted with a .50 caliber gun? They said, what is it? I said, we're going to take you down and train you. Incidentally, this is a beautiful example of the word snafu. You know, in the Army, that meant situation normal, all fouled up. Well, that's a beautiful example of snafu. I did train while I was in North Africa. I trained South African, Belgian, and Free French pilots in the B-26, and we all enjoyed that training because they had a whiskey ration. And they let us sample some of the spirits. Now, I should have told you, when we came back from missions in the Air Corps, we always were given a little glass of whiskey, but some of the men didn't drink. So the flight surgeon, who really was quite a businessman, he had a bottle with a funnel. And if you didn't drink, you signed the sheet, but poured in the funnel. Now, he never told us what happened to that whiskey that he took. I tell you, men think of these things. Well, I'll take you to my last mission, which was my 25th, February 3rd, 1944. We started out, we knew we were going to bomb the railroad yards in Rome. And I should, I guess, told you, what is a mission like before you start? Well, you'd wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning, you'd have breakfast, then you go to the intelligence tent. The intelligence officer, of course, shows you the target, maps of it, what the target is. He also shows you the alternate, because if you run into weather, you're going to have to change your course and go on to the alternate. So you always have two targets. Then your commander gets up and tells you who's going to be the escort for the day. Now, we always had P-38s, the Lockheed Lightning. A beautiful, this is the plane that Major Bong was the great ace in World War II. He flew the P-38. The Germans called that the Whispering Fox Devil. It's twin booms, a beautiful aircraft. We loved them. When I went on my first mission, I had P-39s, if you can remember the Bell Airacobra. It was such a bad pursuit plane that we used to think we were escorting them instead of they were escorting us. We had one mission and gave up on the P-39s. They just couldn't do it. The Italian Air Force, when they were with the Germans, would come up and never attack us. They'd stay out of the range of our guns. We loved them for that. The Luftwaffe would attack, but the Italians, they didn't have their heart into it. They're good lovers, though, I decided. So, then of course you're told about the target, you're told about what type of fighters you're going to bump into. You're probably going to bump into the Messerschmitt 109s or the Focke-Wulfs 190s. And don't let anyone kid you, they were magnificent airplanes. You're told about the flak, the guns, the anti-aircraft in the air. You're told about where air-sea rescue is going to be. We then, of course, were given our escape kits. And in your escape kit, you had $250 in the money of the country that you're flying over. You had silk maps for the area that you're going to. So you had everything you needed. You wore a 45. You had a steel helmet on, although most of us took them off, I'll have to admit, while flying. So you're ready to go on a mission. You start out on the mission, and long before you get there, you test fire your guns to make sure they're all working. Now, I'll tell you something. I'm a bad boy, but I'll tell you this. We used to see the Arabs on their camels going across the Sahara Desert. Now, we didn't hit them, but we would put some right behind them to sort of speed up the camels, make them go a little faster. But we didn't hit them now. We were good. Well, you had to test fire your guns. Then, of course, your fighters would suddenly appear. Now, they were on top of you, and they fly on top, and they're weaving back and forth, and, of course, there to protect you. All right, we started out on my last mission. We're going to bomb the railroad yards in Rome. We got to the IP, which is the initial point where you start a bomb run. When you hit the IP, you now have to fly straight and level. No evasion tactics at all, because you've got to give your bombardier a perfect platform for dropping. We had the Norden bomb site, which was famous, but when we started at the IP, suddenly we're hit by Messerschmitt's 109s. Now they're attacking from 5 and 7 o'clock. Think of the face of a clock. They're coming at us from 5 and 7 and then peeling off. Then they come again and peel off, make another run. Looking at the instrument panel in front of me, the whole panel's blowing up. I mean, the 20 millimeter shells are just pouring in. Not hitting us, but they're blowing up everything. So we, of course, realized we couldn't make the bomb run. Both engines have been shot out. We're at 12,000 feet. The only thing to do is put it in a dive and then figure out what we're going to do. We knew there was cloud cover down below us, so we want to get in the clouds so we can get away from the fighters. We told the crew, the gunners, to come up forward, that we're probably going to end up crashing, going to take it in. The bombs are still on board and they're fused, so we've got to get rid of them. So in the dive, and we're now going between 400 and 500 miles an hour, almost straight down. We opened the bomb bays, we salvoed those bombs, which were all fused. Unfortunately, 2 men disobeyed, didn't pay attention to the orders, and they jumped. When you pull a ripcord in a parachute going 400 to 500 miles an hour, it's just going to rip to pieces. You've got to allow the body to slow down, specific gravity, and then you can pull a ripcord. So they were killed, we know that. To this day, 1 man, we do not know what happened to him. Our bombardier was a new man that we had on this flight, and I told him to low down, to put pillows around his head and cover himself and lie flat, get ready. We're going to take it in to the Mediterranean. Fear has taken over. Now, one of the things, and you don't know this until you face it, none of us do. You can be afraid and you can act. If fear takes over, you're in trouble. You can't act. You're going to be afraid. That's normal. All right, this man, fear took over completely. I had my tail gunner slap him across the head. I tried to tell him, knock him off his feet. He couldn't do it. So when we hit the water at 145 miles an hour. All I had on was a seatbelt. Didn't get a scratch on me. Now, I've had land crash landings. There's nothing to a land crash landing if you're under control. A water crash landing is like hitting solid concrete. It is awful. And you've got to make sure that you go in tail low. If you don't, if the nose ever gets away from you, that's what's going to happen and you won't survive. So we hit it at 145, went in tail low. We ended up on a rubber life raft. One of the most beautiful sights that I will remember in my life. Fighter escort, and we had American Spitfires that day. 4 of them flew over in inverted flight at 20 feet off the water, 4 of them. And they're line abreast, so we can read the insignia on the wings. We have been sighted and reported. The Germans tried to come out because we're off Ostia, Italy. If you know where Ostia is, that's where we went in. And the Germans, of course, control that area. We'd just gone into Anzio just a couple of days before. So they tried to come out in one of their motor torpedo boats to pick us up. Every time they came out, the fighters went in on a strafing run after them. During the time we were in the life raft, we saw a mine had floated to the surface. We went over and looked at it. I always wondered what a mine looked like, so I went over and took a look. We now got picked up by a minesweeper. And any of you in the United States Navy, God bless you, because it's the United States Navy minesweeper that's coming to pick us up. And when he picked us up and took us on board, I mentioned that there was a mine there. He informed us that we were in an uncharted German minefield. And he said to one of his gun crews, I want you to blow up that mine. The gun crew tried to and missed. And then my tail gunner did one of the most dastardly acts. He walks over and takes a set of these guns away from a Navy gun crew and blows the mine right out of the water. Oh, I'm in shock. The minute he does it, the commanding officer of the minesweeper said, that wonderful parachute silk that you brought on board now belongs to the United States Navy, and we will all have wonderful scarves for that awful deed that was just perpetrated. But then he said to us, have you had anything to eat? I said, what do you have? He said, would you like some nice baked Virginia ham? Or would you like a little southern fried chicken? Have you seen the latest issue of Time and Life? Do you need me Hershey bars? I thought to him, how do I join your branch of the service? Well, he said, I'm going to have to take you through an uncharted minefield and into Anzio Beachhead. At that point, I said, why don't you put us back on the life raft? You run the uncharted minefield. He said, Bill, look at it this way. Come on up front, come in the radar shack, and he said, if anything happens, no one on board's ever going to remember it. I couldn't talk him into putting us back on the life raft. Well, he takes us into Anzio Beachhead, which is blowing up. We've just gone in there. The 88 millimeters are flying into Anzio, and they took us, an infantry major took us to a house, and he said, Bill, I don't know when we're going to get you out of here, but stay in this house. I looked in the backyard. They'd got shells piled about 6 feet high. I turned to the three of us had survived. 4 of us we'd lost. I said to the 3, I said, tell you what, I'm thinking of sleeping in the basement. If they drop one in this backyard, I think from the first floor up it's all going. But I think in the basement we might survive. So we all ended up sleeping in the basement. Every time there was an airfield there, Nettuno, and a couple of days they tried to fly us out, but the Jerrys would just lay shots right down the runway. That discourages flying. So here comes an LST, and we're going to ride there, bringing the supplies from Naples to the beachhead. One of the things I will always remember about Anzio is I met Robert Capa, the famous Time and Life photographer. And Bob wrote up our story. Bob, you know, after all the brilliant pictures he did film the Normandy landings. He went in with the first wave. He went into Omaha. He had done landings all over during World War II. He had enough Purple Hearts, could have been thoroughly decorated in Purple Hearts. And his girlfriend was Ingrid Bergman. Pretty nice girlfriend. He also was not just a great war photographer. His photography has been seen in the leading museums of the world this past year. He finally lost his life to a landmine in Vietnam after all he'd gone through. Well, we were taken back on an LST. We got in a winter storm. Now, you know, an LST is only about that thick in steel. And a winter storm and nothing on board because we brought all the supplies up from Naples to the beachhead. That was a wonderful trip back to Naples. When we got back, and I'll tell you this because it shows you again Americans at war. My rescue had been directed by a destroyer escort, which is a ship a little bit bigger than a destroyer. And the minesweeper was the nearest, and that's why the minesweeper picked us up. But the skipper of the destroyer escort, he said, Bill, what's worth seeing in this area? Now, this is February 1944. I said, right out there is the Isle of Capri. But I said, the tourist boats aren't running. He said, Bill, I've got a boat. And he said, the Navy doesn't know where I am, and the Air Corps doesn't know where you are, so why don't we go to Capri? Right in the middle of the war. So for 3 days, and we stayed, if you've been to Capri, we stayed in the Hotel Quisisana, which is still one of the most beautiful hotels in the world, and we did the Blue Grotto, Tiberius's ruins, Anna Capri, the town of Capri. We did every inch of the island. And after 3 days, we had a sense of guilt. And he said, don't you think we better get back to the war? So the Navy returned and the Air Corps returned. We finally got the review board of the 12th Air Force decided after what we'd been through, and we had flown our last mission, that they thought they'd better send us home. So they sent us home. And when I got home, I went through the redistribution centers at Atlantic City. Then I went through the redistribution center in Miami. And I didn't make the one on the West Coast. I haven't figured that one out yet. But I still had a guilt complex. I felt that I had lost my bombardier's life. I did have hold of his hand, trying to pull the body out of the aircraft, but I'm convinced that he was so seriously injured or dead, and that because there was no effort at all on his part. But I still had the guilt complex, so I ended up in the Don Cesar, St. Petersburg, which is a lovely hotel today and a National Historical Monument. I went through sodium pentothal treatments, the truth serum. And of course, you're totally unconscious, and they're asking all sorts of things. They even asked me if I was gay. I mean, they have to read back to you all the questions. That's required, because they've interviewed you and you're unconscious. So of course, he had to read back everything and what my answers were. But then I was put back on flying duty. I went to Randolph Field, the west point of the air. I was one of the few returnees at Randolph, and I asked to be sent somewhere else. I got very discouraged. You realize we're in the middle of the war still, and congressmen are coming down to Randolph Field to see an air show, and these fools are putting on air shows for them with a war going on. Well, that was, and then one night, one day, the squadron I was in, he said, "We're going to fly night formation tonight." I put my hand up and I said, "Do you have any idea what the American Air Force is doing? They're flying in the daytime. The British do the night flying. And when the British fly at night, it's at assigned altitudes and on timed appearances over the target. They are not flying 1,000 planes in formation." I hate to think what the death toll would have been. So I said to this young man that I'm going to fly with, and he had not been overseas, I said, "All right, tell you what, we're going to take off here and we're going to go straight on out, and we're going to fly for miles, going straight on. I'm going to lose this group. Because if they think they're going to kill me in night formation flying after what I've been through," I couldn't believe it. So I got sent to Columbus, Mississippi, one of the most beautiful dry areas in the United States. So I went to Columbus, Mississippi, and there I ended up in charge of one of the squadrons, and one of the memories I have is I had Lowell Thomas Jr. as one of my cadets. And when the class graduated, Lowell Thomas came to give the final address. So that's one thing I enjoyed. A final comment that I'll make is that when I did get out of service after 5.5 years, I ended up going to Georgia Tech, and I know that Don Lee is a fellow rambling wreck. And we were living in Marietta, Georgia, and we used to get a ride into the campus every day in a Cadillac. Now the Cadillac belonged to Alfred L. Glancy. And General Glancy was in charge of Army Ordnance in World War II. Now he went, and he used to love to tell this, he said, "I went from the vice president of the Pontiac Division of General Motors, I headed up the Pontiac Division, to Brigadier General. I didn't go through any other ranks on the way." And incidentally, General Glancy was a graduate of Lehigh. He was a trustee of Lehigh University. And he later did a very nice thing. He helped his son buy the Empire State Building. So what, after all. Well, finally ending this, I hope you've read Citizen Soldier by Stephen Ambrose. I hope you've read D-Day by Stephen Ambrose. And I certainly recommend The Greatest Generation by Tom Brokaw. 3 wonderful things. Stephen Ambrose, incidentally, in the book about D-Day, there's a wonderful part near the beginning. He's telling about Andre of the French Underground. Betty and I, when we were in France, we met Andre. And it was on an elder hostel. And he said, "After dinner, there's nothing scheduled. Would you like to hear about life in the French Underground?" There were 45 people on that elder hostel. And every night for 3 nights, 45 people rushed into the dining room to hear the exploits of the French Underground. So, if you have any questions, I'll try and answer them. But I know I'm lucky to be alive, and but it was an experience, and I'm sure all of you sitting here have got similar experiences. Yes, Paul. Well, you got to remember that UDEP, before the war, was one of the world's great stunt pilots. Mike Murphy, Tex Rankin, and UDEP were the three great stunt pilots before 1939. Did air shows all over the world. But he ended up second in command of the Luftwaffe. Yeah, yeah. Anything else? Go ahead.
You have an interesting accent, and that's one question. The other is, what you do after the war?
All right. Park your car in the Harvard Yard. Where do you think I'm from? No, New York. Oh, no. Yeah. All right, he wanted to know what my accent was, and I grew up in New Bedford, Massachusetts, which used to be the whaling capital of the world. Incidentally, my great-grandfather was a whaling captain and sailed out of New Bedford. And those voyages were for 3 years or longer, and I have his log. All right, the next question.
What you do after the war?
All right. After the war, I went through mechanical engineering at Georgia Tech. But when I got out, they weren't even stockpiling engineers. They didn't need them. They have phases in engineering. They're desperate for them, and then they have another point when they got too many of them, the heck with it. So I ended up in employee benefits, group life, group health, pension plans, and went with the insurance company in North America, then with the New York Life. Then I was with Hudson, Ravinas and Company, the insurance brokers here in Philadelphia. Sidney Hutchison, incidentally, was the son-in-law of Mr. Stotesbury. And if you know the name Stotesbury, we had contacts all over the nation because of Mr. Stotesbury. Then after that, I ended up an officer of the Provident Mutual Life Insurance Company, and I spent my time in sales. At one time when I finished up, I had charge of administration, claims, underwriting, contracts, the legal end. Yeah. And I loved it. But engineering is a wonderful education. Yes, Bob?
Bill, do you have any comment during World War II on the impact of women being in service as they related to the men in service?
Well, you know, now we did end up, of course, with the waves and the wax. To me, the saddest thing as far as women in service were the wonderful ones that flew our planes overseas, the WAFs. And, you know, they weren't recognized until long after World War II. And Jacqueline Cochran and some of the great women flyers, they were flying all types of planes, B-17s, B-24s, 25s, 26s, and they were flying them to the different war zones. And lives were lost. So that now as far as the WACs, of course, naturally were in the Red Cross centers overseas. We used to see them. There weren't any women in combat as such. I think one of the sad things was, of course, the way we treated the Negro. That was one of the tragedies of World War II. The Navy wanted them only for messmen. Finally, near the end, they were able to have a better chance for a career in the Navy on board ship. The 99th Pursuit Squadron, all-black squadron, was in my theater, the Italian theater, heavily decorated, wonderful pilots, but no whites in the outfit. I'm trying to think, remember that probably the most heavily decorated outfit in Europe was made up mainly of Japanese Americans, and they won more awards than any other outfit. So when you think of the way we treated the Japanese Americans, when you think of the way we treated the blacks, we had some tragedies. But no, we didn't have any women involved. One of the British officers that I had tremendous respect for and I got to know was Air Marshal Tedder, T-E-D-D-E-R. What a wonderful man. He was second in command to Eisenhower. And Tedder, he looked like a hawk. His face, you looked at him, my God, there's a man that looks like a bird. But what a man. Montgomery, I didn't love too much. Monty would move if he had 100,000 guns and you only had 5,000. If he had 200,000 tanks and you only had 500 tanks, Monty was ready, let's move. And Eisenhower had more trouble getting that man to do things. Patton, I loved Patton. I had a friend of mine that was on his staff at the time of the Battle of the Bulge. You know, it was the Third Army that went to the rescue of McAuliffe. And he gathered together all the generals of the divisions of the Third Army. He said, in 24 hours we move. Generals got up of divisions and said to General Patton, I cannot put 16 to 18,000 men, tanks, and all this mechanized equipment on a highway in 24 hours. And his answer was, following the meeting, recommend who replaces you in command, because the Third Army moves in 24, and they did. When you go to Luxembourg, even today, they love you in that country, because that was where a lot of the Battle of the Bulge took place. And they will greet you and treat you, and they love you in Luxembourg. They should. But, no, I have a lot of memories, and loved them. I saw the 8th Army when they came off the desert, one of the great armies of the world, which was broken up, of course. But, and Shepherd's Hotel, if any of you went to Cairo before World War II, beautiful hotel. And when the British left Egypt and the natives took over, the first thing they destroyed was Shepherd's Hotel, because that represented Great Britain to them and they didn't want it, so they